So this first webinar is about how to prepare a strategy for data analysis. A short outline. I will presenting the main goals of this presentation, then present what we call the traditional approach to research, and then I will extend on what we think that should be the approach to research, which means thinking in a reverse order, and I will explain what it means. I think that after this, that covers roughly half of the presentation. We may have a discussion on these more methodological issues, and then I will present case study that follows this methodology. And we can have a discussion at the end on the details. Anytime you want to chip in, just raise your hand and I'll try to answer your questions. So the main objective of this webinar is how to make our research more efficient. With two secondary objectives. One is presenting a case study, the CGIAR project, that follows all the process of designing a survey from the definition of information needs. And a second secondary objective is to understand that all the whole process is driven by the information needs. I've been discussing with you what are your research plans, and I think that most of them follow what we call the traditional approach. The traditional approach consists of a first step of selecting the method. I want to do focus group discussions. I want to do a survey. Then designing the research process, which means designing the tools, designing the questionnaire, designing the sampling, designing the survey, these kind of things. For example, going to the field and collect data, analyzing this data, and writing the report. And the question is any of you using a different approach? I guess not, so we go. This traditional approach may work well in specific circumstances, basically when processes have standard protocols and when the research is carried out under fairly controlled conditions on routine procedures. However, this is not always the case. In a lot of the research that we do is carried out in complex conditions, and that makes that this approach probably is not the best one. So why this approach is not efficient in complex conditions is that because sometimes we may collect more data than needed, and some data may not be used in the analysis, and you wouldn't. I mean, I come across many times of data that has been collected and has not been used or has not been analyzed. Sometimes the results could be not very informative. The results may not challenge our views. We may not be able to collect the data that is needed to achieve the results that we are looking for in our research. And as a consequence of all this, the results could be of limited interest sometimes. So we propose a different approach that challenges the sequence that we use to think about the research process, and with this is changing the logic of the whole process. And the logic is that we propose is to work backwards. This is the reverse approach. With this new approach, working backwards, we start by writing the final report. Then we select the appropriate approaches. We go to the field and collect data. We process the data to generate information. We compare the evidence generated with the report, and then we analyze the results. Now I'm going to go in detail on these 6 steps. So we start by writing the final report, which has some advantages. The first advantage of this approach is that of starting by writing the final report, is that we are forced to define, well ahead of doing the field work, what are the final products of the research process, and we have to do this with a high level of specificity. We have also to make our assumptions explicit, and the research process will either verify or challenge these assumptions. We have also to find information from other sources, which leads to a better informed and more relevant research. We can, ahead of doing the whole work, share the report with stakeholders and discuss with them what are the results we expect to find and get insights from them. And stakeholders can be colleagues, can be donors of funders of our research. And finally, this approach of starting by writing the report makes us define what information we actually need. So, defining this information that we actually need, we need to define what data needs to be collected, how this data has to be collected, which methods are we going to use to collect this data, and defines the subgroups, the categories that are important for the research. And that should be taken into account when the research is designed. So if we want to take into account male and female, we have to ask for male and female respondents. If we are interested on splitting the report or the tables in group ages, we will have to have these group ages well defined and asked about it. So once we have this draft final report, we select the appropriate approaches. In complex environments, rarely we rely on a single approach. We probably need more than one approach, and most of you are using either quantitative and qualitative methods. So we have to decide on this mixture of approaches and methods. But since we already know the information that is needed, because we have written down in the report, we have a better starting point for the selection of methods and for the timing of all these methods. What comes first, what comes later, when we have to ask these things. So this process means that selecting all the way down from methods to the instruments and tools for data collection. And this includes the selection of the type of partners that we want to work with and the right skills needed to carry out the research. Then we have the draft report, we have the final report, we have selected the methods, we go on the field and collect data. There's not much to say about that. So when data is collected, we process the data to generate information. And doing this, what we are doing is crunching the data, processing the data to get tables, to get graphs, to fit models, to carry out statistical tests or other kinds of data processing. So we are converting the raw data into information, because information is what we are going to use for the analysis of our research. So we have generated evidence from all this process, and then we can have two types of outcomes. We either, the evidence generated either validates the assumptions made at the beginning in the initial report, so that's fine, but we have to prepare ourselves to be surprised when the assumptions are challenged by the data. by the information. So we can have these two kinds of outcomes. And now, with basically at the end of the process, we can update our initial report with the new evidence found during the process. Finally, as the last step, we will analyze the results. And here we would like to make clear that in this approach, processing data and analysis of results are two different processes. We have already processed the data. We have already got tables, graphs, models, right? So what we are going to do in the analysis of results is basically ask ourselves three kinds of questions. The first one is what? What means, what are the results that we have gotten during all this process? What are the indicators that we have produced during the analysis? And we can ask ourselves also why we got these results. Can we interpret these results? Is these results that we got challenging our initial assumptions? If they are different, why are they different? What can explain this? The second question we may ask ourselves is, so what? It means, okay, we have got some results, and what do these results actually mean? What does it mean for the research, for me, for the stakeholders, for the people, for the livelihood breeders, for whoever is in this process? And finally, now what? So, okay, we got some results, and how we carry on? What are the new research questions that arise from these results? What are the consequences? What are the future actions? How can we apply these results to new policies, to new arrangements with partners? What do these results imply for livelihoods? So again, new questions. And as a conclusion of this first more methodological part, with this process of reversing the sequence of the research process, we are changing the logic with which the research is carried out. And this new approach should have been able to answer all our research questions in a more efficient manner. Okay, so with this, I finish this first more methodological part, and it's a good point to have a short break for any kind of questions or discussion you want to have now.
Thanks very much. I'm intrigued by the suggestion of reverse process, and my question is just if you could clarify a little bit, when you talk about the first step being writing the report, can you unpack exactly what you mean by that and how much detail? Are you talking about writing an outline of the report with some hypotheses, or yeah, how far down that line would you go?
Okay, I think Carlos would like to answer your question.
I actually, Cynthia, I encourage people to go in detail with the report, as much detail as possible, and this is often very counterintuitive, because people say, "Look, Carlos, if I could write my report, I wouldn't be doing the research at all." So what I argue is that it is quite healthy to put in paper the specifics of what we expect to find, and that is with as much detail as possible. Probably, but definitely putting the tables and the graphs that are going to be informative. So, for example, I might decide that one of my graphs is the criteria for breeding fish that in descending order of importance by male fisher folk and female fisher folk. So that actually is a very specific table, and I would probably say, well, I would expect that males, and I know very little about fish, but I'm going to make this up. I would expect that males are interested in the size and the weight of the fish, while females are more interested in the taste and in the fact that the fish has to be abundant rather than rare species. And therefore the reproduction rate is very important for them. And I will put my list of possible priorities and the order that I believe they will come in. So I will go with as much detail as possible because that is going to allow me to specify the type of data that I need, and probably the pre-coded answers that I am interested in, leaving the possibility for my questionnaire for others. But also it is going to prescribe the type of processing that is going to be important. So if, now I'm going to change my role. I am not the researcher. I am the data cruncher that is going to support the researcher. So as a data cruncher, I will receive this draft report that is very detailed, and I would receive the instruction of, could you please fill in these tables? I put the numbers that I think should come, but see how the data compares or not with what I have written out of what I believe will happen and out of what previous research tells me. So as much detail as one can will improve the process. There is often the question of, look, I have no idea and I don't want to prescribe. That is also allowed, but I think in most cases we have either knowledge that is to be verified or hypothesis that we want to test. The process of writing down at the beginning helps enormously to make the quantitative side more efficient. And I think there is a hand up from Juliet and one from B. Lenhiso. I can only read your names as they appear on the screen. So Juliet, would you go first?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. I think it's really informative, and it helps us think through the processes that we're going through right now. And for me, I want a little bit more clarification with respect to, you know, when we're writing the reports, often we're under a lot of pressure to not put all the details in, because most of the times we might not even be writing a report. We have to go straight into writing a paper for publication in a journal that has restrictions on word count, X, Y, Z. So I wanted to know if it makes more sense to analyze the results first and see what story the results tell us before then adding more information to the other sections of the report or the publication. Because sometimes, you know, you go through your data analysis, but you've already written some sort of a introduction, and you've provided a lot more information on your methodology section. So is it more advisable to maybe have a skeletal structure for your introduction and your methodology, and then flesh out the story from your results, and then write the introduction, or flesh out the story in the results and then refine the introduction? What sort of advice can you provide on that?
Okay, I would say that probably the introduction and the methodology part, it's something, I mean, the methodology part goes in the second step. So probably we have not really decided already what kind of methodology. So when we think about the, or when I'm talking about the report, I'm more talking about the results part of the report or of the paper, if you want. Probably the paper you have to summarize very much what you want to show, and probably it's the second step. The thing is, when you make sure right at the beginning what sort of information you want to have at the end of the process, and the information means which table, with which kind of disaggregation, answering which question. If you can do this right at the beginning, if you do this right at the beginning, you make sure that at the end of the process you will have this table or this graph. Maybe the figures in the table are not those that you thought right at the beginning, but at least you have the information that may challenge or may your assumptions, or may validate your assumptions. The thing is, if you don't do this right at the beginning, chances are that at the end you won't have the information that allows you to answer this question. So if you know what is the information that you want to have at the end, you make sure that your process of data, of the design and data collection, will provide this information, will provide the data to get this information. Otherwise, you may not have it. And you wouldn't believe how many projects I come across with questions that cannot be answered because data was not collected properly, because these questions or this report was not written right at the beginning. Here are probably two kinds of levels. One is what we call the data analysis plan. That is something that I'm going to go through now in the second part of the webinar, which is the list of tables and graphs that you would like to have from your research, your analysis, your data processing, which is all this information untreated, if you want. And the second step, which is writing the narrative or the how you explain these tables, and this is writing the report. So at least have this list of all the tables, but writing the report is when you end up realizing whether you have everything you need. And you are not, and also you are not trying to collect data that you are not going to use. Again, many times I come across with huge questionnaires with many questions and many data that were not even analyzed. So why doing this?
Should we go for Lengiso?
Virjano.
As Virjano.
Yes. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. Yes, the reverse approach looks very interesting and very new. But when we look at from what we do, especially the mixed method, I think we are also doing something very related to this reverse approach, maybe even more informed reverse approach. Because, for instance, I conducted, for example, focus group discussions to get an idea of what type of research questions are worth investigation, and based on that to design the tools that I have to use for more in-depth quantitative studies. So in that case, I have a report from the qualitative study that helped me to design the tools to go and do like deep quantitative study, then write a report from the quantitative study and triangulate back to the qualitative findings. So in that case, don't you think this sequential mixed method approach, where we get reports from the qualitative study that we can compare to the quantitative latter final quantitative findings, and often combines them to come up with a robust reporting is close to the reverse approach? Is it really new when we compare it to the sequential mixed method approach?
Okay, Carlos asked me to make a
Alex,
comment, and I'm not sure.
Alex, sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just reverted to the language that I speak to Alex without realizing. Barahona, you're absolutely right. And this is something very interesting about reversing the way that we design research. And it is that if you are very clear about the information products that you need, then you can decide on the mix of methods that you're going to use. And you're absolutely right. If you're already using mixed methods, it's very likely that either in an explicit or implicit manner, you're using a very similar method. And here I wanted to make a comment. We are using the word report to represent the collection of information products. Okay, so it is a collection of information products that you need, that your stakeholders need, and that are described with a high level of specificity so that the selection of methods and approaches and the choice of what data to collect are very well targeted towards achieving those information products. And that's why the efficiency appears. But then I can see why the concept can be quite it's not intuitive, because my report, as Juliet was saying, might be not a report. It actually might be a scientific paper. Now, a scientific paper is nothing but a very condensed summary of some learning process, of something that we have learned. So a scientific paper comes much later. However, at the point of design, we have a number of assumptions, a number of hypotheses, and a body of knowledge with which we design the research that will eventually later on lead to the scientific paper. So it is not writing the scientific paper in full. It's actually setting up in writing. And in writing is important because it's only when we write that we force ourselves to think carefully. In writing, the tables with numbers, the numbers that we guess, the graphics that describes the trends that we expect to see, writing down the reasons that why we expect to see these relationships or patterns. And that is what we refer to in this presentation as writing the report. But you're right, especially if you are using mixed methods, then this seems to be a very natural consequence of the choice. And that's why we say this is unavoidable if we are engaging with complex research situations. If we are in a lab doing a series of tests with bacteria, then having the protocol, going through the data processing, and then looking at the results is good enough. I believe we got Seamus.
Hello.
Hi, Seamus.
Hi. Thanks everybody for a really great workshop and all the interesting questions so far. I've just two quick questions. So the assumptions I think that we wrote in the design of the research are similar to some of the results that the tables have shown so far. It's that across the resource poor sample of consumers, the number of households and the level of consumption of fish is lower in Upper Egypt. But also tilapia, which is the cheapest fish, is even more popular in Lower Egypt among those fish consuming households. Now, the trade preferences between men and women has been collected with two approaches. So quantitative ranking and qualitative ranking. So the quantitative ranking is looking at the priority traits, and then the qualitative ranking is looking at the weight of those values depending on the traits. Okay, so a lot of information there. My first question is, I think I need some help maybe before the workshop to think about defining these subgroups. So, but not just geography, but it's been purposely sampled to look at the economic groups. Can we differentiate them further, and especially around the questions of gender and decision making, maybe the gender norms? I need to think about this. So that's my first question. And then the second question is, maybe we can talk about this later, but do you envision how I might be triangulating between the preference findings? Maybe any tips about preparing the two data sets, or specifically the qualitative data set, getting it ready for analyzing the results in terms of, I don't know, models, tests, or simply more accurate ranking tables.
Okay, I wasn't sure whether Carlos wanted to intervene. Okay, I'm starting by the second question. This is something that we are going to deal with in the next webinar. So preparing the data and having checks for data quality control and all these kind of things is going to be the topic for the second webinar. And the first one was about the subgroups, right? But this is a crucial question, and we are going to discuss a little bit this on the case study now, as soon as we finish this discussion. I would say that that this is the reason why we expect, or we suggest starting by writing down all these tables right at the beginning, because it's when you may realize that you have or you have not the right disaggregation, the right subgroups. Probably it's a discussion in each, for each table or for each research question is a question to be discussed, which is the right disaggregation here.
Yeah, I'd like to add something, Alex.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
For me, the difficulty with how we bring together different sources is we don't have formal frameworks to do this. So our ability to bring our knowledge, the contributions of other experts, the review that we do of literature, the data that we collect in the field, the ability that as researchers we have to do that depends on each individual. And that's why we see different qualities and different rates of success at getting your papers accepted, and distinctions in dissertations and etc. Or thesis. So this proposal that we are making is an attempt to provide a flexible framework. And so I will go back to analyzing how this might help with the triangulation process. You see, in my process of defining information and testing against data, I to communicate with the audience of researchers, to communicate with stakeholders that might be the communities, and to test against data, there is no option for me but to have very specific information, very specifically defined information products. So here it is. So if I have a proposal that the subgroups that are relevant for my subject of research are these, as you have already worked out some of them, Seamus, then I would like to, first of all, be very clear to myself which ones they are. I would argue that proposing them well in advance of collecting the data might be useful, so that you can make sure that you collect for those subgroups or for those specific cases. So doing it in advance, writing them down in advance should be useful. Triangulation then comes when you go to your supervisor, to your colleague, to your community of scientists, and you say, this kind of thing is what I am proposing. And they will tell me, Carlos, you are completely mad. Don't you know that Cynthia has already tested that and it's on this paper? And then we go to the secondary information, and then we start triangulating ahead of data collection. Then we say, okay, so I've got a new set of subgroups that comes from my knowledge, informed by secondary sources, comes from key informants, and I now want to go and test it. That is when we say, okay, so if these are the categories, the best way to get to these categories is not to ask the questions in a questionnaire. I actually need, these are very sensitive issues, I need to use a social approach, social sciences approach that allows me to make people feel confident and at ease and reassured of confidentiality. And then we go for the social approach. And then we say, oh no, these are very easy. People would be quite capable of answering them out of a series of questions that I ask directly. So a questionnaire is good. So we choose the method. And then we choose the data that we want to collect based on that. And if we are sure that that is the full set of options, we don't need to open it anymore than what we have decided. If we are unsure about whether this is the full set of options or subgroups, categories, then we open it. But that influences the development of our tools and the data that we collect. Eventually, the next step of triangulation or verification is what comes with it from the data. And what comes from the data is checked against all the sources that formed our initial thought process. And I think that is exactly what you're doing at the moment, Seamus. So for me, you're at the stage where you had already all that accumulated information and defined information that took you to those subcategories. And we are going to look at how the data verifies or challenges those assumptions. Now, and I'm going to make a piece of advertising here. Remember that the PDFs that are engaged in this process for very specific things that relate to your research, we are going to be working with you on your data, on your case-by-case basis, not as part of the webinars, but as part of the help desk. And that will allow us to go in depth into the issues that you are talking about from a quantitative point of view.
Hi, good afternoon. Sven from WorldFish. I am not part of the group, but I was invited to join. It's very interesting. And I just have a quick question to probably Carlos. So about the final report as you describe it here, is it for you, so to say, the research protocol? And then the second related question is, in how far does the process of writing this report up front helps you in terms of seeking ethical clearances, etc., prior to research? Because based on my experience, if you, in humanities at least, you conducting research, qualitative research or surveys, you would have to, in most fields, get an ethical clearance nowadays. So, and that requires you to hand in usually a very detailed research protocol where you explain what kind of information or data you collect and how you're going to use this data to convert it into information, etc., etc. So maybe you can just explain, based on your experience, how that probably the final report helps also in terms of ethical clearances and all these processes. They're very important nowadays prior to data collection.
My opinion, Sven, is that the main advantage of writing it in advance is that you will be able to generate a protocol that can be justified and defended better. And the reason why that will be the case is that your protocol will reflect exactly the information needs. And the main advantage, and I think the challenge that we often have, is that the information needs are too vaguely defined. That is the main message of this, that we want to discuss with you. Very often the information needs are too vaguely defined, and therefore the protocols are not targeted to those information needs. And doubtless, and I am 100% sure that the process of thinking carefully about what information need and what are the specific aspects of that information will give you a better position to present your case in front of an ethical committee. And in the area where I work, I've seen far too many cases where research is carried out without ethical approval, because until recently that was not considered necessary, but I think we should be much more aware that it's very important to have that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Carlos, and I would say that, yeah, when presenting your ethical clearance protocols, presenting also these are all the information products we are going to get, these are the tables and graphics and that we are going to get, I think that helps in this process. So it cannot be of any damage doing this, of any harm doing this well beforehand. On the contrary, probably it's a plus and assures that you will get the information you're looking for.
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree, and I guess it's also probably a really good mean. I mean, if one is clear on what information you're going to collect and for what purpose, that you're not putting an extra burden to the households from where or your partners in research to make research a burden for like target households, etc. Because you're collecting information just as much as possible, but you're not sure for what purpose you're collecting it, and then it's probably also often difficult for households to spare more time, etc. So thank you very much.
Yeah, for example, in a project we were working last year, it was targeting female in women in reproductive age, and this went from 15 to 49 years. And the adolescent women, the women in between 15 and 19 years old, were a specific case in which the consent was different, and the ethical issues were raised because we were partly targeting this population. So knowing this in advance and designing all these research protocols, writing down the information products that we were looking for well before the starting of the process and the ethical approval was a plus, definitely, because we had already taken into account that we were targeting this population, and so extra care and extra ethical layers were put in place in order to conduct this research.
Okay, so Alex, do you want to continue with the next part of your presentation?
Sure. Thanks. It's been very interesting. So now I'm going to present a case study, which is the CGIAR's project we were working on until a couple of years ago. The CGIAR is a CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. Probably it's not exactly of the same kind of project that you are dealing with, the research project you are dealing with, but has some similar characteristics. The goal was to measure how agriculture practices are evolving in response to climate change and other pressures. And the methodology chosen was to work with local partners to organize a series of surveys and consultations that started in 15 sites in East Africa, West Africa, and South Asia, and then was extended to 10 new sites in Southeast Asia and Latin America. So we can say it was kind of worldwide approach. The study wanted to see how these practices were changing across time. So the idea was to have a baseline at the beginning of the project in order to understand the profile of farmers' practices in each of the sites. And then the same sites would be revisited 5 years and 10 years later to look at changes in livelihoods and farming practices. So the idea is that by exploring these evolving patterns, collaborative research for development programs can learn how to best support farmers and their communities. And understanding why certain practices are spreading and the influence of key challenges such as climate change can lead to more effective rural development pathways. So yeah, the idea is see how farmers adapt and cope with the changes due to the climate change. So we started defining the information needs, and the goal was to measure how agriculture practices are evolving. Now I'm going to target this small part of the goal, are evolving in response to climate change and other pressures. So what does are evolving mean? And the idea is to monitor the key behavior and farming practices, how this behavior and practices change over time. The second part of the goal was defining the agriculture practices, and so we want to see which are those agriculture practices or farming practices that are changing, and we also have to define who is going to provide this information. So we can start writing this final report, understanding of a final report of these information products. The idea is to monitor the key behavior and practices changes over time. So the time scale is 10 years, and where is basically worldwide, or at least all the regions where CGIAR is working. Then we have to define the what. What are we going to ask about? And we want to ask about changes in livelihoods and changes in farming practices. So we end up with something like, sorry, let me enlarge this a little bit. What we call the analysis plan. The analysis plan would be the report, the empty report. So the report with only the empty tables and the draft of what the graphs should look like, without any narrative accompanying them. So here's a question. Part of this is a very long. This is a almost 70 pages long data analysis plan, full of tables and graphs. Now I'm going to have a quick look at a few of them. One of the research questions was, do the on-farm water sources differ according to whether the household is female or male-headed? So we have to define what this actually means. And we can combine into female and male and female-headed households, or we may expand these categories into these 6 here on screen: male-headed with a wife or wives, male-headed divorced or single or widowed, female-headed divorced, single or widowed, female-headed husband away, female-headed husband away, but female makes most of the decisions, and child. And the 6th option was child-headed. So see that we may have just a couple of categories of options here, or we may expand into a larger number of categories. So once decided this, and here categories are merged, are combined, we end up with a table like this, in which, sorry, we have the 2 types of household, depending on who is the head, and these different types of on-farm water sources. And this is going to be populated once we get the data and process it. The second question was, is there any relationship between these on-farm water sources and the membership of relevant community groups? So we have to define those groups and then ask the households about the membership of these groups and combine them in suitable categories. So again, we will end up having a table that we will populate once we process the data, and we will see whether, and we can make assumptions when members of irrigation groups have larger access to irrigation, for example, than non-members, and then once we get the results, we can challenge or we can validate these assumptions. And the third example of this is our on-farm water resources related to availability of household water resources. And again, what does availability mean? So we have split this into three categories: water storage tank, well or borehole, or running water into lake. And see whether there are differences, and then we will end up with a table that we can run tests on it, etc., etc. Right? So,
Alex.
Yes.
Alex. Sorry.
Yes, please go ahead.
Can I ask you a favor? First, could you change the scale of your Word document so that we can see the table, more of the table? Yes, and could you hide the ribbon? This one? Yes, if you go to the fourth icon on the left-hand side of your top of your screen, you can hide all of that so that we can see your document better.
I don't know what you mean here.
Top right-hand side, sorry. Top right-hand side, there's a cross, there is the fourth one from right to, yes, you can hide all of that and we can see better.
Okay. Sorry.
Yes, now we can see your table. And I actually want to make a comment about your table.
Yep.
About your tables, and it is that in this case you are very specific about the layout of your table. You have well defined what you have in each row. So these are the on-farm sources of water, and then in this case, in this context, those were relevant, and those rows became options in your questionnaire.
Exactly.
And then you have well-defined, very specific defined the columns of your table, and those became options or choices for answers in your questionnaire.
Exactly.
So this table defines the fact that this question is going to be asked using a questionnaire and the content of the question. The other thing that is quite clear to me in here is that the table is going to present the percentages of the answers, and is also going to include the numbers of the answers. And that tells me that I am going to be counting. It tells me how I am going to process the data. And so as a data processor, if you give me a data set and this layout, I know exactly what to do. And the thinking process of getting to this table was done ahead of going to collect the data in the field. And I think that is part of the way towards writing the report or defining completely the information product. What might happen when we are actually doing it, what should happen is that I am going to put the percentages into the table, and I'm going to make my best guess about what those percentages would be. And that next stage is very useful, and it's very useful because it's by putting my hypothesis or my current knowledge onto this table. Once I collect the data, I can compare what I thought was going to happen with what actually happens. And then I was right. Oh, it's not going to be exactly the same, but I was right. The pattern is as I was expecting would be quite useful. Confirmation, oh, wow, that is totally different from what I thought was going to happen. Why do they have more water ponds? And that will lead me to find out whether there was a project, whether there was, and this process of inquiry and confirmation is better supported by our data. And so I just wanted to make sure that we could have a good idea of what your table was going to look like and how, in this process of reversing the sequence, that plays a specific role.
Thank you, Carlos. Very helpful. So yes, the idea is that the information needs drive the whole process, and here the information needs drive the process of writing these reports, or what we are expecting, what we would like to get out of all of this research process, and drives also our data processing. So, for example, here when we have this table, these percentages are percentage with respect to what? We want that all those that have irrigation, which is the percentage of those that have water storage, well or borehole on running water in dwelling, which means that these three here will end up adding 100%. Or we want to see those that have water storage, which is split, the percentage is split into these different categories, or we want above all of them, summing 100%. So depending on what is the need, the information need, what is the answer we are expecting, what is the information we are expecting, we will collect the data in a way, or we collect some data or some other data, and we will process the data in a certain way or a different way. Okay, okay, so we start by writing this sketch of report, or this final report, and better if we try to guess with the information available, with what we know, what with literature review, the tables, and have an assumption or an hypothesis of what's going to happen once we collect the data and analyze it. So once we have the sketch of the draft of the report, we will select the methods, and we already know that we are going to. We have to select who is going to provide the information, and the decision made was that there are going to be 3 different sources of information. One is going to be farmers individually on their individual, and they will inform on their individual practices. We will also like to have the village as informant on, and will inform us on communities' views, organizational and information networks, and the collective views and hopes and concerns about the future. And finally, the project also targeted the organizations working in the area in order to understand what is the network of NGOs, the work with local authorities, governments. So once we have set all this up, we have to decide, we have to go to make decisions on how this research process is going to be carried out. The when or the timeline is that we want a span of 10 years and collect data in 3 different points: at baseline, at the initial stage, which is time equals 0, at the end, after 10 years, which would be the end line, and also we want a midline review after 5 years. And where this is going to be carried out in 25 different sites in 19 countries in East and West Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. So now the point of the study was defining the baseline, And so we wanted 3 different sources of information. And so we are going to use 3 different methods to get this information. In order to get the household farming practices, they were going to conduct a household survey in which they were going to ask about farming practices and sources of livelihood and changes in the past years and all these kind of things. On the village information focus group, group discussions are going to be carried out in order to map out gender differentiated information about the state of natural resources and the vision of the community about the future. It also wanted to capture the organizational landscape and see how the information networks worked. And finally, interviews with organizations working in the area to explore the information, the connections with local authorities, the work with local authorities, and so on. So now let me concentrate on the first one of these 3, which is the household survey. So the goal is to monitor, in the household survey, is to monitor changes in farming practices, and then we have to define who we are going to target, and the universe of this survey is the farmer households. So any households that do not carry out farming practices, I don't know, teachers or shopkeepers or whatever, are not going to be targeted in this survey. Only households that make their livelihoods out of farming practices. And the type of study is going to be a panel survey, a panel study, which means that the same households will be interviewed in the 3 different moments: initial at baseline, at the end line, at the end after 10 years, and in the midline study after 5 years. Which means that we have to record lots of information about the household, the farmer, the location, because this will allow us to come back to this same household after 5 and 10 years. And yeah, and this implied taking not only the name of the head of the household, but also recording with GPS the location of the farm and taking pictures of the farm and the farmer. So we are sure that when we come back 5 and 10 years afterwards, we will meet the same farmer. So yeah, the information needs and defines the methods and what kind of data we want to collect. And we make sure that we collect this data and make possible to come back after 5 and 10 years to the same farmers. So what are the farming practices that we are interested on? And then this would define the indicators we will compute, and the indicators will help to write the questionnaire. So in order to design, we are in the methods stage. In order to design the survey, some extra information, some extra technical information is required. So at what level we want to report? We want to report at the national level, we want to report at the provincial level, at the district level, at what level we want to report. And this has implications on how this survey is carried out and what is the sample size and the sampling methods. And also, what is the precision we want to achieve? This is something that we are going to discuss in the coming webinars, but defining the precision of the estimates is basically it has consequences on the sampling size that will be needed. So the project is large, huge. It is very ambitious and has a long list of indicators. Here I'm going to just go through a few of them to have a flavor of what was all this about. Some examples of indicators. One is the ratio of female-headed households. And we probably are not really interested on this as per se, but the percentage of female-headed households is a good proxy for vulnerability. Usually female-headed households are more vulnerable than male-headed households. That's what we may want to, if we want to understand vulnerability, this is an interesting indicator. Second indicator, percentage of households introducing 3 changes or more over the past 10 years. And this gives an idea of whether the farmers are already changing their farming practices in order to cope with adverse climate or adverse shocks, or they are adapting to the new conditions. And also, it gives an idea of also vulnerability. So if they are already changing, those that are already changing means that probably will have more ability to adapt and to cope with the bad times coming. Source of other indicators, examples. Source of cash income other than on farm, and this would also give us an idea of diversification of income. Product diversification, again, idea of information about vulnerability and adaptability to changes, market access, and many others. So with all these indicators defined, it's easier to understand why this data analysis plan or draft report can be written down. And for each of these indicators, we will provide the table or the graph that is needed. So this data analysis plan is the collection of all the tables and graphs required to meet all the study objectives and indicators, and includes all the detailed specifications of any estimates. So any disaggregations we are looking for, or what is the shape of the graphs, or what is the information that would be included in each of them. So the idea to write this report is to anticipate what are going to be these graphs and plots and models that we are going to need. And this helps us think about the results we are expecting, and helps us to, if you want, write this narrative that would be on the side of these plots and tables. And helps us to make sure that everything is there, that we read all this data analysis plan, or we read all this report, compiled with this initial report, we make sure that everything we need is there, that nothing is forgotten. And when we have this, we have also all the relevant information to define, to write down the questions in the questionnaire. So, example, ratio of female-headed households. And then on the final report, we may have a table similar to the one we have here. So we have 3 categories plus the others. So we have the male-headed households, the female-headed households, and the child-headed households. And then we have the number, and we can compute the percentages. However, we may want to have something a bit more detailed, in which we are not happy just having male-headed households, but we may want to disaggregate this again into those that are already, those that are married with wives, or those that are without wife because they are either single, divorced, or widow. And the same with the female-headed household. So when deciding which is the table that we need, we are also deciding how are we going to ask some questions in the questionnaire, and what is the level of information that we expect to gather from the survey. If we expect something like this table in this slide here, we will have to make sure that all these categories are asked at some point in the questionnaire. If we are happy with a simple version like this, a simple question or a reduced number of categories will suffice in the corresponding question in the questionnaire. Okay, so well, this is if we are happy or we are expecting some sort of table like this one. The question related to the head of the household will be something like this here, in which we have all the possible categories well coded. So then, of course, when we have this, we go to the field, collect the data, process the data, populate the tables with the actual results of the data processing, and see whether they validate or challenge our assumptions, and then see what we can do with all this process and write the final report papers, and maybe plan ahead what comes next after we got these results. So basically, the whole process is driven by, as a conclusion, the whole process is driven by the information needs. We are defining the 5 W's: why, when, where, what, and who. And with this, we want to make sure that this process of defining the tools and the data we are going to collect will achieve what we are looking for. And that's it from the presentation.
Alex, thank you. Should we open the space for people to make comments and
of course,
and
sure.
questions? I just want to give you a pause for you to take a breath and see if there are any comments from the audience.
Thanks.
Seamus, go ahead.
Hello, hi. Thanks again, Alex. Really interesting outline of a study plan. I think in maybe your third last slide, you said it's important for us to have more detailed specification of the estimates, the tables, the tabulations, and the information needed in writing an analysis plan. And this helps us to think about the results we're expecting, but also how to present them, which provides a good representation of the tool. What do you mean exactly by that? A good representation of the statistical, the model, the approach? Yeah, so I'm thinking again about my qualitative data set and the more about the questions of why these trait preferences are coming up. So yeah, what do you mean by that, maybe?
Seamus, is this one?
It's just, I think, maybe either above that, the 2 data analysis plan. So yes, so there we go, that one before, so 32.
That one?
Yeah, so this process helps us to think about the results. Ideally provide a good representation of the tool, so the questionnaire that you develop. Okay, so you're not thinking really about the statistical analysis or models yet. You're thinking about the survey.
Well, no, actually we are starting by I mean, we have already defined the statistical analysis that we are going to carry out. We have already defined the tables, which means that we have already defined what we want to get. For example, what we have seen before. Let me go back to that. So here, we have defined already that we want to count, we want to compute the percentage. We have to have decided already what this percentage is with respect to, if it's respect from those with those two are have irrigation, or so it's row based, or it's column based, or it's table based. So we have already decided this, and we have already decided what kind of plots and graphs are we going to provide, and we have already decided what kind of tests and models are we going to fit. So this is already decided, and we are using this data analysis plan or report that has already been written in order to define the next step, which is, remember, backwards thinking, which is defining the tools, which is defining that we are going to carry out a survey with a questionnaire and defining clearly the questions in this questionnaire. That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. That really clears it up, and I've got some questions now to think about for preparing.
Do we have any more questions? Stephanie, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks a lot for the presentation. I really like this approach, how do you call it? I forgot the name. Background approach, and especially because you force us to make very explicit our hypothesis and what kind of data do we need. And as you say, the type of analysis we will try to carry on. My question is just a request, a small request. As I'm like a graphic person, I like to see a lot of graphics. Do you have an example of a graphic that you have in this data analysis plan? Just to show an example of like a fictive graphic that you expect to have without getting the data yet?
Yes, but I need a couple of minutes to look for it. So please go ahead with questions, and Carlos may be trying to answer them while I'm looking for this. For this,
I wanted to show you Alex's slide 32, because there is another really good advantage of doing this process. I hope what you are seeing is the slide that says data analysis plan, and there is a table where we have in the rows the household type, and in the columns the number of households and the percentage of households. There is a really important thing that comes out of producing it, and it is, once you have this table, then there is the question is, the team wanted this table and I wasn't sure why. So one of the big advantages of being very specific about the information products that we have is that once we see it, we say, well, why do we want that? What is it going to support? How it is going to help my process? And I would argue, and I am an extremist in this field, I would argue that we don't produce any information product that is not going to be of value. So the table of percentage of male-headed, female-headed, and child-headed needs to be assessed in terms of the value that it adds to the information that we want. So we might not want to produce this table. We might to have these categories where we want to have this male, female, and child-headed compared with others, because we have a hypothesis that male-headed have advantages in reaching markets over female-headed and child-headed households, and therefore that information product is useful. And the hypothesis is we need to actually set up programs or initiatives that help female-headed and child-headed households to have access, and the limitations that they have are in relation to ability to transport, getting access to setting up a stall in the market. And you see how I can, around one of these tables, generate a series of hypotheses or put knowledge that I have that is going to become part of the information product. And once I have that, then I know why I want to ask the question. I decide that the question should be asked in a questionnaire. I decide what questions specifically are going to be required, and therefore eventually I end up with the data that is necessary to generate the information product that I am after. Over to you, Alex.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that's an example of percentages of households across dependency load classes, whatever it means. here, yeah, this is the table, and this, well, the empty table if you want, and this is an example of graph, a pie chart of what may happen once you analyze the data. Does it answer your question?
Yes, yes, perfectly.
Okay, good. So it's an example, and yeah, I mean, it's not data-based, it's what can happen.
And sorry, I was expecting somehow you will get something with time as reference, but maybe am I going further because
no, you're definitely going further because this was the baseline. So
okay.
It was the starting point. Yeah, there's no data at midline. Just the collection of data for midterm. So after 5 years is going to start sometime soon, but not yet. Has not yet been started.
Okay.
Okay, Stephanie, here is an example of the type of graphic, and this is work in progress. I was discussing this with some colleagues who are doing some study in Bolivia. And so, I don't know if you can see my screen, there are some pictures there with graphics with green lines.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so basically these are experiments with farmers. And there are some farmers that have a treatment and some farmers that don't have a treatment. So they are very naive, early stage of becoming farmer experimenters. And we were saying, okay, so what is the information product that is required here? And it is, I would like you to see the graphic that is on the top left-hand side, this one, okay? And basically, what we have on the vertical axis is, so how frequent is the presence of this pest or disease? And the on the horizontal axis, we have the percentage of plants affected in a farmer. So farmers with very few plants affected will be right here at the beginning of the graph, and farmers with very few plants affected will be here at the end. And the number of farmers will be on the vertical axis. So some that has a treatment, someone with treatment will have very low frequency, therefore at this end of the axis, of plants affected by the pest. So we were discussing with them, so what is it that we are expecting to see? And they said, well, we were expecting to see that farmers that are using this set of treatments will have a pattern that roughly looks like this. Many more at the beginning with very few plants affected, so high frequency, and very few with a high level of damage due to the pest. And this is for the farmers with the presence of the who are using the treatment. In contrast, on this other side, farmers who have not used any of these biological treatments we will have a high frequency of farmers with high frequencies here of farmers with a high number of plants affected. And so the discussion was the shape of the curve. The shape of the population is going to change, and we're going to be able to see that the frequency with which the pests and diseases appear changes between farmers who use the biopesticide with relation to those who don't use the biopesticide, and we expect the difference to be quite large. And so after this discussion, they are formulating now and writing a preliminary report, and they are going to be using graphics like this to present the evidence that comes from the 150 farmers that they are working with. And so you can formulate this in a tabular approach, or you can formulate this in a graphical approach, and it's very helpful to prepare these graphics to engage in discussion, in this case with the researchers and later on with the farmers, so that the information product is validated before the experiment is put in place. So I don't know if I hope that gives you a different take
Yes.
on the
Yes.
type of preliminary information product that can be produced.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, it was to show that we can introduce in this report already some fictive result without numbers. I mean, for example, in the frequency, it's not numbers, but focusing on the terrain. And what you just mentioned actually it seems to be part of a discussion with experts, so kind of participatory approach that you help this expert discussion to how do you say, to make explicit what they expect on their research question.
Exactly, and therefore we all know in which direction we're going to take our data collection, so that we can provide evidence that verifies or challenges the set of assumptions that we have. And of course, this is the scientific method, but the difference is that we are forcing ourselves to be very specific in terms of information products, so that we go to the field to get the data that is relevant and necessary to verify or challenge our assumption. And there is a lot of triangulation in that process. I'll stop
Thanks.
sharing now. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Carlos. Any other comment, discussion, question? Okay, Pip.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm also, I guess, a visitor to the group, so thank you so much. I think it's a really useful forum, and it was really easy to follow. No, I guess I just want to say, I think what you've presented makes a lot of sense. It probably is something that we've all done. I guess it's a continuum, right? The way we sit in our preparation of thinking things through. And I guess you guys are pushing it further to the end of like really fully thinking it through. And I think that's useful. Yeah, I'm not sure I will be going all the way to the extent that you perhaps suggest, but definitely, you know, see value in moving further along in thinking, you know, those tables, graphics about how we will present data. And I think this is a really useful tool as well to advise, I don't know, earlier career researchers to really, I mean, you see a lot of mistakes in preparing data or collecting data that just has absolutely no use in the end story. And it should have been obvious, or it becomes obvious in retrospect. So I think this process is useful for avoiding that. So yeah, really appreciated it. Thanks.
Yeah, I would say that writing the report has lots of advantages, but at least write down the data analysis plan, this set of all the tables and results you expect, tables and graphs and models and tests that you expect from your research. So you make sure that everything that is there will be in the data collection tools.
I suppose that's something that would be really useful. And Pete, thank you. Yes, this is a spectrum. And you are right. We're pushing for as specific as possible. And you are right that early career researchers would benefit a lot from this. You'll be surprised about the number of later career researchers that I work with that don't do it. And it's life. Life is too short, and we need to go to the field before we have had to do the time to do this. And we've got 3 or 4 researchers that are working with us, that each of them is going in a different direction. And so, yes, life gets in the way of structured and carefully planned. But the more we can be specific about information products, the better. From the point of view of people like us who are support with quantitative data analysis. One outcome of this approach that would be useful is to have our researcher colleagues coming to us with very specific questions, saying, for example, I have this hypothesis and my data seems not to be validating it. Could you help me finding out how to check that what I think is happening is supported by the data? That would be really nice. What I would like to avoid is the people coming, and it often happens, saying, look, how do you suggest I analyze my data? And so the last example is what I think every researcher should avoid. And we should aim to asking the question to ourselves or to our quantitative data analyst support that specifies the content of the information that is required to validate what we're looking for. And the problem with the statistics, and we hope that in one of the webinars we're going to come to it, the problem of statistics is that it is seen as a separate collection of statistical tests that sometimes are useful. And in fact, it actually provides a good framework to answer specific hypotheses about information that you're interested in. So if we have a good definition of those hypotheses, and I don't refer to statistical hypotheses, but scientific hypotheses, you would have those scientific hypotheses well established, and you have collected the data that helps you testing them, then your quantitative methods is going to be more effective. And that is the message. Don't go and collect data unless you are absolutely sure that your hypotheses are going to be tested by the data. Very rarely we go into the field without having a set of hypotheses to test. And if we have the luxury of not knowing anything about the field, then yes, go and explore, go and observe, but then probably you will not be using a questionnaire. I finished that.
I think that we may finish here. Thank you very much, everybody, for your for being there and for your contributions. And next week, same time, we are going to have the second one. This is going to be hosted by Carlos on data quality, data management, and all these kind of things. Is that correct, Carlos?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes. So looking forward to having a discussion about that.
So speak to you in a week and have a nice week. Bye to everybody.
Great. Thanks so much.
Bye for now.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.